Beauty. Thank you, Graham. So for the agenda tonight, we'll start with our speaker for tonight, Dr. Aaron Eger, who will be zooming into the meeting. After the presentation and Q&A, we will move on to general business as usual. For the Zoomers out there, first of all, a reminder to please mute your microphones if not already done, so we can't hear any background noise from your place. During the presentation, I ask you to keep your microphones muted. For the Q&A session, you can ask questions by virtually raising your hand in the reactions box or using the chat function to send a message to the off host that you want to ask a question, or you can type your question into the message and it can be read out for you. Please mute your microphone after asking your question if you do it that way. For those here in the audience, it's just a matter of raising your hand, but I will ask you to come to the front here and ask your question so that it can be picked up by the microphone and heard by our speaker and others on Zoom. So the people out there on Zoom are hearing it through the microphone in this laptop. So we need to base ourselves, if we're talking to the audience and out there in Zoom, right place in front of the microphone. That would help a lot. So to our speaker tonight, our speaker is Dr. Aaron Eger. He is an OFF research grant recipient and founder and program director of the Kelp Forest Alliance, KFA. It's a global research-driven, not-for-profit, working to change the status of kelp forests. Marine kelp forests cover 1/3 of our world's coastlines, supporting a rich tapestry of biodiversity throughout our oceans, but they are increasingly threatened, with some areas reporting over 90% declines. Together with 550 kelp experts, professionals and citizens from 27 countries, the KFA is launching the Kelp Forest Challenge, calling for the restoration of 1 million and protection of 3 million hectares of kelp forest by 2040, a monumental challenge. Aaron is also lead author on the first kelp restoration guidebook. With that brief introduction, I'll hand over to you now, Aaron, to tell us all about it.
Splendid. Thank you so much. Really lovely to be here, and thank you for having me. This is a bit of an interesting talk because I think the award that's tied to this presentation was actually about 2 years ago and for a bit of a different project, and there were some COVID shifts in research and sort of, I don't know, illustrating the twists and turns of life of where you think you're going to end up doing one thing and 2 years later you're doing the next. So this chat will be very different to anyone who's actually read the proposal that was tied to it. But I'm really excited to be talking to you about the Kelp Forest Alliance, which, as was mentioned, is this global initiative to create a movement to protect and restore and celebrate our kelp forests all around the world. So I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea from which I'm working, the Gadigal people here in Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And as we think about this conversation, I really want to talk about how we can protect our marine heritage. So how do we restore the natural heritage of our ocean, and how do we protect what's remaining? Because to me, that's really what the environment is to me. It's our heritage, it's our connection to the past, it's the essence to our future. Oh, yeah. And traditionally, there's been a sort of approach to working with caring for the environment where we might treat it kind of like a museum. You know, it's locked away from people, it's viewable, but only from a distance. And increasingly, what we're trying to put forward is more the environment as our home, really. It's a place of being and connection that supports our daily lives, but also requires our support in return. So I would argue that when it comes to saving our marine heritage, we really need to go down this direction. We need to recognize that people are connected to the sea. They can be part of the problem, but they can also be a really powerful part of the solution. So for myself, my connection to the ocean started when I was a little bit smaller. I would go out boating with my grandfather just off the west coast of Canada. And we would load up our little aluminum boat, roll down the boat ramp, and head off in search of orcas, or killer whales. And these are an emblem of the Pacific Northwest where I grew up. And then whether we had blue skies or more commonly gray ones, we had a pretty good chance of spotting a pod of orcas and their gigantic dorsal fins slicing through the Emerald Canadian seas. Then once we were off the dock, there wasn't so much you can run into on the ocean. You know, there are very few lampposts or mailbox out on the sea. So from time to time, littler and younger me was actually allowed to captain the ship. That was until we steered near a forest, because once that happened, my captain's hat would be taken away. Because if I steered into that, our engine would go dead and we would be floating until we could set ourselves free. Now, for the unconverted in the room, you might have heard just like a little bit of a paradox. You know, one instance we're out on the ocean in a boat, and then the next I was at risk of driving into a forest. Well, as outlandish or paradoxical as that might seem, it's entirely correct. Because beneath the waves of our colder seas live seaweeds known as kelp. And a lot like the forests on land, kelp forests provide the thread for a rich tapestry of marine life. But instead of ferns, flowers, and frogs, you get kelp, cod, and creatures with 3 hearts or 10 legs. These underwater forests occur on over 1/3 of our world's coastline. And if you've ever gone for a walk in the forest, come back the next day, and the trees are about 30 centimeters taller, I'm guessing very likely not. But with kelps, you can go snorkeling one day, return the next, and those seaweeds might have grown by about the length of my arm. So this incredible productivity also means that these forests are filled with animals of all variety, from the smallest snail all the way up to those orcas that we so desperately wanted to see. And these kelp forests have a deep connection to human history throughout the ages and across our coastlines. We have good evidence that kelp forest ecosystems help move people from Asia into the Americas as they relied on the bountiful resources supplied by kelp to fuel their journey. Across the Pacific, kelp harvest has played an important role in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese societies, where they've been used to pay taxes and dowries since the 8th century. In medieval Europe, kelp was used to fertilize soil and increase crop yields, to treat goiter. It was even used to fortify building materials for centuries. In the last century, the 20th century, kelp forests have become a main source of alginate, a really common and important food and medical additive. And still today, hundreds of millions of people depend on kelp forests as they provide food and fisheries, produce oxygen, remove water pollution, draw down carbon, and are cherished spots for scuba divers, snorkelers, and the ocean-minded alike. Our recent analysis suggests that kelp forests all around the world provide a value of about $500 billion a year. And this is only based on the fish that they provide, the carbon they capture, and the nitrogen they remove from the water. This doesn't even begin to cover the feeling you get when you're free diving amongst their sunken branches, or the pride and joy of a parent teaching their child how to sustainably harvest seafood, or the personal connection that you get knowing that these ecosystems supported our ancestors on the coastal fringe. But today, we're faced with mounting problems. So I'm not actually sure how many people are in the audience, but let's imagine that 90% of the audience got up and left. I think we'd notice a difference. And this is exactly what's happening to kelp forests all around the world. In Tasmania, we've seen a 95% decline of kelp forests in the last 50 or 60 years. In Northern California, we've seen 95% decline. And where I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, there's been 80% declines. And all throughout our continents, these ecosystems are shrinking and threatened and disappearing. And with this destruction comes the loss of billions of dollars of value, our shared cultural heritage with the sea, and whether we know it, a little piece of ourselves that was sustained by these ecosystems. So these threats are really pervasive, but unlike on land, few people are actually cutting these forests down. Instead, we're seeing just how powerful human activity can be. So through a terrible dance of addition and removal, we're reshaping the very fabric of our oceans. As we continue to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we continually push that thermometer up, making the seawater too warm for kelp to survive. Our continued demand for seafood is eliminating top predators like sea otters, lobsters, or really big hungry fish. Normally, these animals would forage on and control the numbers of marine herbivores such as sea urchins. And continually, all across the globe, we pump nutrients, sediment, and pollution into our coastal seas. And the results are cumulatively devastating. Globally, we've seen 40 to 60% of kelp forests degrade in the last 50 years. So how do we fix this? Well, according to that museum paradigm, the last things the ocean really needs is people. So surely if we remove ourselves from the equation, life can rebound on its own. Unfortunately not. We've taken notice and we have tried slowing down pollution and easing our harvest of sea otters and other predators, but in many cases, it just doesn't seem to be enough on its own. We're not seeing the return of kelp forests once we step back. So perhaps we need to try a new approach to caring for our marine heritage. Perhaps we actually need people to be able to save our kelp forests. Well, fortunately, we have them. The Kelp Forest Alliance is a global group of people all around the world dedicating to save our kelp. And we're building a community of purpose that weaves people into the ocean, acknowledging that we take from the sea, but also take care of the sea. The Kelp Forest Alliance was founded as a new way to look after oceans, a shared home for anyone who works on, loves, or is interested in a kelp forest. So whether you're a snorkeler or a CEO, if you speak English, Spanish, Norwegian, French, Japanese, Portuguese, Korean, if you paint or do science, you have a home for the Kelp Forest Alliance. And this philosophy is in recognition of the fact that there's no single one solution to saving our seas. We need everyone doing their part together to succeed in our mission. This is a societal level problem, and we need to create societal level solutions. And so we only formally launched the Kelp Forest Alliance in April 2022. We've grown quickly and now have a network of 550 people from 200 organizations in 27 countries. And this is everywhere you can have a kelp forest and then some. And 750 million people live within 50 kilometers of a kelp forest. And while we might not be able to get all of them to create an account on the kelpforestalliance.com, we truly want this to be as inclusive as possible, that global home for kelp. And as we were building the Kelp Forest Alliance and planning our work, we started to ask ourselves, what are the biggest barriers getting in the way of kelp conservation today? And ultimately, we found that a lack of capacity or technical ability, lack of awareness or support, and ultimately a lack of funding and resources were the most pressing issues. And so while our mission started with research at the University of New South Wales, we're committed to a variety of solutions and work to address 4 pillars. The first is that key science, the knowledge needed to manage kelp forest. The second is building partnerships, the collaborations needed to conduct and amplify the work. The third, education for awareness and understanding needed to motivate people. And fourth, advocacy, the voice needed to champion kelp forests and promote their success. So many of you might be asking, how do we actually restore an underwater kelp forest? Well, planting kelp forest is a lot like planting trees, except your gardener cannot breathe and they're digging into solid rock instead of soil. But I assure you it's entirely possible. So let's have a look at some of the ways we can regenerate these kelp forests. In Korea, they have a term that roughly translates to marine gardening. And this analogy extends beautifully for kelp, because the ways we can save our kelp really are a lot like the ways we work in our gardens. We can till the soil by making it easier for kelp to grow on the seafloor. We can distribute seeds into the ocean and hope that they take root. Or we can grow plants in a nursery and transplant them fully grown back into the sea. You can even add sort of raised garden beds if the seafloor has been damaged. And if the waters are now too warm, we can select and breed heat-tolerant species and individuals to put them back into the ocean. And this underwater gardening also has its share of pests. You know those caterpillars that might chew through your tomatoes? Well, kelp has a similar problem, and they can be munched on by spiny herbivores called sea urchins. So, as we work to remove the caterpillars, we can also work to remove the sea urchins, And just in the same way you might keep a chicken around to pick off pests, we can protect or restore missing pieces of the ecosystem, such as sea otters, lobsters, and big hungry fish. And these animals will naturally prey upon urchins and help the kelp forest thrive. More broadly, we can improve water quality, reduce pollution, reduce sedimentation, and limit invasive species to create a healthy home for kelp forests to thrive. Kelp restoration has a rich history, beginning in Japan in 1718, when a monk taught villagers to throw stones into the ocean to regrow kelp. It's now grown to 19 countries around the world and is rapidly becoming an important field with many lessons to learn. However, these lessons are often lost and information isn't shared easily or efficiently between different projects and organizations. So through the Kelp Forest Alliance, we're working to put all this information and keep these lessons together in two ways. First, we partnered with nearly 1550 kelp scientists from around the world and worked to create the world's first kelp restoration guidebook, an instruction manual on the best practices to restore kelp forests, understand when it's necessary, and plan your project, looking at everything from consulting the community to monitoring your outputs and planning for a future warmer ocean. We also began to celebrate 11 projects around the world that demonstrated efficient or creative solutions for restoration. These range from giant scale restoration projects in Korea to projects involving local communities spreading awareness about the importance of kelp. More technically, we also built an online database to host past project information with the idea that we could enhance information sharing, standardize how data was collected, and allow people to upload new data to share new lessons that they learned and make sure that information didn't get stuck in a report in somebody's desk. So about a year ago, with the Kelp Forest Alliance, we had a passionate community of people and organizations, many of them really world leaders in their space, all dedicated to helping the kelp. A growing belief that restoration was possible, but it needed more support. A consolidated data platform for sharing information and lessons while also tracking the global status of kelp restoration, how much we actually achieved across the world, and a persistent feeling that kelp really was the forgotten forest beneath the waves. We had data, knowledge, and passion, but we needed to focus all of that to achieve the change that we wanted to see. And many of you may agree that these large global issues need to be tackled with large global coalitions. And we've had a lot of success with these sort of projects in the past. So we've had global treaties limiting CFC production, protecting heritage buildings, and protecting animals from pandas to salamanders. Despite all of this, the world has never had a global target or agreement for kelp forests. The world's largest marine habitat, valued at billions of dollars, fabric of our cold water seas, was largely ignored in global policy. Our first thought was, well, who do we have to ask to go create one of these targets? And very quickly after that, our second thought was, wait, we have the scientists, community groups, resource managers, artists, business leaders, and even some governments that are working to protect and restore kelp forests in every country that we have a kelp forest. Why don't we make the target? It can be grounded in the best available knowledge and community consensus, but importantly, it can move quickly. Kelp forests are disappearing as we speak, and we cannot afford to wait for the wheels of government to turn to create this target. We work to create a vision and bring it to the world in the hopes that they can support it. So we got to work. We worked to create the Kelp Forest Challenge through a series of online workshops across time zones, consultation with about 250 kelp scientists and experts, and pondered what a target for kelp forests should look like. We considered how much kelp do we have, how much is lost, how much is available to invest, what capacity do we currently have for restoration, and what do we think the world just should do to save our kelp? And as we were planning this, the wheels of the government did start to turn at a higher level. And in December 2022, the world came together to create the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which some of you may have heard called 30 by 30. And this is a simple concept that we need to protect 30% of our world's ecosystems and restore an additional 30% of degraded systems by the year 2030. So we had a bit of a benchmark for what the world was thinking, but we now need to think about how we can apply it to kelp forests. And traditionally, kelp has been a bit forgotten. So there hasn't been as much work on kelp forests as there has been on coral or seagrass or other terrestrial ecosystems. So the year 2030 was quite an ambitious value. And with that in mind, we decided to aim for 2040 with this global mission to protect 3 million hectares of kelp forest and restore 1 million hectares by that year. But importantly, the Kelp Forest Challenge isn't just about hectares and government actions. It's about building a movement of people that want a new relationship with our sea and who are willing to support it. Therefore, we created a broader scope than's been done before. And we invited pledges to not only protect or restore kelp, but also to enable these actions, raise awareness and understanding about these ecosystems. So this way, when businesses, professionals, media teams, educators, the citizens of the world ask how they can help kelp, we can bring them under the same umbrella and work towards the same goal. And when we launched back in February, we had 22 pledges totaling about 40,000 hectares for restoration, 7,000 hectares for protection, and pledges from artists, tech companies, and businesses looking to make a difference in the marine space. As of our last update in June, when we had the next consultation round, we're up to 28 pledges, totaling about 55,000 hectares for restoration, and expanding to include education campaigns by aquariums and social media impact campaigns. We've also been able to work with the different levels of government. So we've gone all the way to the federal level in Korea, where they've pledged to restore 30,000 hectares of kelp forest by 2030. The state or regional level in Washington State in the United States. We've pledged to do 4,000 hectares also by 2030. And even at the municipal level in Portugal, where the municipality of Cascais is working with the for-purpose business Sea Forester to restore their local kelp forest. So really, there's room for any level of government to get involved. But there are many, 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 many more municipal, regional, and national governments out there with kelp forests. And we now need to think about how we can connect with them and talk to them about adding commitments to create marine protected areas for kelp, clean up water pollution, rebuild healthy marine food webs, or replant these underwater forests. But as I said, this mission goes a bit beyond just area. So let's look at some of our other pledges. We have the robotics company Hullbot, who's pledged to loan their robotics technology to help monitor and assess the health of kelp forests and potentially even manage invasive species or problematic species. This is a Sydney-based company, and we're really excited to have them working to apply this tech into the kelp forest space. From the artistic side of things, and I'll see if the sound plays properly. We have an artist who's created a song called Golden Kelp on her harp, and she's now touring Australia, playing the song and raising awareness about our kelp forests. And finally, one of my favorites from a social media campaign team, creating short, easy to watch videos just to get people thinking and talking about things. Not just anybody. I need someone. So really, there we have it. We can get by with a little kelp from our friends, and anyone can get involved. This is where we are today, only 8 months into a 17-year mission to save our marine heritage, to save that connection to the sea, and to save our kelp forests. And so as we grow, we'll continue to invite new organizations, companies, researchers, professionals, and citizens to join the Alliance, conduct targeted research, champion kelp, make pledges, and protect and restore the shared heritage of our kelp forests all around the world. And what we do know is that we'll need everybody in society pulling together to secure this heritage into the future. So thank you all very, very much. If you'd like to learn a bit more, you can visit us on our website, or I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period to talk a bit more about any questions you might have about kelp or the work that we're doing more specifically.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll call for questions. Is there any coming in on the chat line? Anybody here in the audience like to raise a question? Deb, would you mind coming up to the front, please? Just watch the cables under your feet.
Hello, Aaron. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I was under the impression that rising sea temperature was one of the biggest threats to kelp forest survival. I was wondering what are the main threats in the New South Wales kelp forest and the Tasmanian kelp forests, and if it's temperature, is there anything we can do about it?
So temperature is a big problem for kelp because kelp loves cold water. It's a temperate and a polar species, so you don't find it in the tropics. In New South Wales, we haven't seen as many temperature-related declines, but in Tasmania, the giant kelp forests, which I mentioned in the talk, have disappeared by about 95% in the last 50 years. So that's due to a combination of rising water temperature, reduced nutrients for growth, and an overabundance of sea urchins, which can then just devastate the kelp forest. So that's quite a wicked problem, which is why we've seen such a precipitous decline there. But more generally, if we're faced with warming water temperatures, kelp can be quite adaptable. So it's actually quite amazing. The main kelp we have in Australia is called the Colonia radiata, or golden kelp, and that occurs all the way up onto the border with Queensland in 24, 25 degree water, all the way south to the bottom tip of Tasmania, and 8 or 9 degrees at times. So kelp can be really adaptive. And what we're doing now as researchers is looking to harness this adaptability. And when we start to do those restoration efforts, find the populations that can survive in the new temperature regime and use them to create the new population. And more sort of generally, as I mentioned with the Tasmania instance, when you have those stressors or those problems stack up, it becomes a really big problem. So if we can remove those other impacts that we have more control over, like water pollution or overabundance of invasive species, then kelp will have a better chance when it comes to adapting to these warmer temperatures.
Thanks, Aaron. Any more from the audience? Janine?
Hello, Aaron. That was very interesting. Can you describe a typical method you use for the actual regeneration process, and how successful is it in general?
So currently there's two main ways to actually actively restore a kelp forest. You can seed it, which means basically distributing the microscopic life stage into the water. And we'll often do that by placing bags filled with kelp blades, which will then release the seedlings, if you will, onto the seafloor. Or you can transplant them, which means securing them to the bottom of the seafloor, which is a hard, rocky substrate. And currently, both of these approaches are quite time intensive. So there's a really wonderful project here in Sydney called Operation Crayweed. If you go on their website, you can see a little bit more about their kelp restoration method, but it requires a lot of work. So one of the main problems we've identified and are pressing to find a solution towards is how we can create a more large scale, easy to do and cheaper to fund approach to restoration, because it is currently a bit limited, but it's not a problem that a lot of people have applied their mind to at the moment. And the people that have applied their mind to it tend to be marine ecologists like myself, and not necessarily engineers or chemists or biotech people. So I think there is a lot of potential for solutions to these problems, and we just need to come together and really start to think about how we can innovate those larger scale seeding approaches so we can do it on a bigger area than it's been done in the past.
Anything coming in on the chat, Graham? No, nothing there. Tony, come up to the front. Switch the cables on the floor.
Thank you. It's very interesting. The fish that you seem to have in the background, if I had to nominate what they were, in Australia, they'd be called blackfish. Luderick, I think, is another name for them. And if you want to go fishing for blackfish, an essential is to have green weed, and it's a much. I just wonder if that's a kelp, because all the kelp that washes up on the beach in a big stalk that's waves of it's grown too big for its own good, and it's been washed off the waves have washed it off the headland and it lands on a beach. I don't know if any kelps are inedible or poisonous, but whenever I see that, I snap a bit off and walk up and down the beach chewing. It's surprisingly fibrous, and whereas the green weed, the blackfish seem to, well, that's the only thing you can catch them on. Is that just a micro version of these large kelps that we see on the screen there?
So first of all, good news, there's no poisonous seaweeds. So you can eat seaweed from a clean environment quite safely. And this is not legal advice, medical advice, or any sort of binding contractual advice, but do avoid eating seaweeds in polluted areas because it can absorb the contamination and becomes unhealthy that way. But in general, yeah, seaweed is actually really a potentially amazing food source because it grows incredibly quickly with very few resources and just has packed full of nutrients and vitamins. And for what the blackfish like to eat, that's more likely a smaller seaweed. So the way you can think about it is all kelp are seaweed, but not all seaweeds are kelp. And so kelp are the really big kind of eye-catching three-dimensional seaweeds that you find in the colder waters of our oceans. And then something like the green weed would be a green algae, most likely, that you see kind of growing on little mats, kind of turf like grass on rocks. So you could think of those seaweeds as like grass, and then kelp forest is like trees. And that's kind of the difference in the marine space for these organisms.
We'll come up with a roving mic sooner or later. Shall we do?
Hi.
G'day.
I wanted to talk about the Australian documentary 2040. And I know that it's made a lot of headlines in Australia. And inside that documentary is how I became aware of marine permaculture and the floating pontoons that they're kind of setting up around the world. My question is, how much did the other side of the world actually see of our Australian documentary? Did it get the traction and the broadcast? And was that message kind of spread on your side there and on kind of the other side of the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I know Damon and the people behind 2014 is a really wonderful film. I'm not sure how widely viewed it's been outside of Australia, but these ideas are certainly starting to percolate, and there's a lot of interest and momentum behind marine permaculture for food or pharmaceuticals or additives, these sorts of products. And kind of going back to the same bit for the food question earlier, it's great because you don't need to add fertilizer, you don't need to add fresh water. It's this resource that can be grown really efficiently and with really low impact on our environment. So I think there'll be an increasing investment there. Europe's quite far into it at the moment. I think it's a bit more restrictive in the west coast of North America. It's a bit restricted here in Australia as well, just with permitting and regulations. And then really the mecca for it is Asia. And they've got by far the world's largest seaweed production in Japan, Korea, a little bit in China. If you ever see, excuse me, satellite imageries of the seaweed farms there, it's just giant swaths of the ocean that have been used to cultivate these organisms.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more? No? Got nothing on the chat? Okay. Do you want to read it out?
More of a statement than a question.
Can you see that on the chat?
Yes, so they're talking about the opportunity to harvest sea urchins as a food source. So in Japan, again, a little bit in Korea, and also some places around the Mediterranean, sea urchins are actually really a prized food item, and they go for quite a bit of money. So there's this opportunity to collect the sea urchins, which are a problem for kelp forest, thereby helping the kelp and also creating a sustainable economy or income source for the fishers that are doing the collection. But because it remains a bit of a niche food item, really, in a lot of parts of the world, the demand for it isn't super high. So yeah, we are actively working to increase that interest and increase the appetite for eating sea urchin. So if you ever see sea urchin on the menu, give it a try, see what you think. Again, it's really low impact, sustainable, high nutrient seafood. And in this case, it has the potential added benefit of helping the kelp forest.
Yeah. Come on, please.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Aaron. That raises a question. There must have been a natural predator of the sea urchin. In our part of the world, blue groper eats sea urchin. And I know up in your part of the world, the sea otters eat them. So is there a movement of not just collecting them, but trying to restore the natural predators that might have been eating them anyway?
There is, and that's traditionally been the focus of creating a marine protected area, is putting in those fishing restrictions, so then you can protect the predators that would normally prey upon the sea urchins. There's starting to be some conversations, and I think they need to be careful conversations about speeding up that process. So, for instance, back home in Canada, we actively stock salmon into the